There's a nut that changed the world and almost nobody alive has tasted it. You have said its name thousands of times. You may have said it today. It is baked into the identity of the most recognized brand on earth, printed on billions of bottles and cans, whispered into every stadium, every airport, every gas station on 6 continents. And yet the plant itself, the actual seed, the thing that gave that brand its name, grows on a tree most Americans have never seen and could not identify if it fell from the sky and landed on their car. The nut is called cola, and its story does not begin in Atlanta. It begins in the humid forests of the Gulf of Guinea, in a stretch of land that today includes Nigeria, Ghana, Cameroon, and Sierra Leone. It begins with priests who used it in sacred ceremonies, with kings who paid tribute with it, with traders who carried it across the Sahara on the backs of camels centuries before the United States was even a rumor. It begins in a world where a single dried seed, the size of a chestnut, could seal a marriage, welcome a stranger into a home, or serve as currency at the edge of an empire. And then, in 1886, a wounded veteran turned pharmacist in Georgia crossed an ocean with a bottle, borrowed the name of that nut, borrowed its bitter caffeinated punch, and built one of the largest fortunes in human history on top of it, without ever really telling you where it came from. This is the story of how a West African seed became the hidden engine of a global empire, and how that empire, worth more today than the yearly output of dozens of small countries combined, quietly buried the origin story of its own name. So how does a sacred seed from the forests of West Africa end up as the most repeated word on the planet, while the people who traded it for 1,000 years are erased from the label? To answer that, we have to go back, not to Atlanta, not even to New York. We have to start under the trees. The cola tree grows tall and slow. It takes 7 to 12 years to bear fruit. When the pods finally split open, they reveal seeds the size of chestnuts, colored anywhere from cream to a deep purple red, made into one fresh, and the taste is not sweet. It is bitter, astringent, faintly floral, and then minutes later, something happens. You feel awake, not jittery, not rushed, just clear, sharper, present. That feeling has a chemical name. Cola nuts are rich in caffeine, in some varieties more than a strong cup of espresso, plus theobromine, the same gentle stimulant that gives chocolate its subtle lift. Long before anyone in Europe had heard the word caffeine, people in West Africa understood, precisely and empirically, what this seed did to a tired body. They understood so well that they built entire trade networks, spiritual systems, and diplomatic protocols around it. Here's what schoolbooks in the West rarely tell you. For at least 1,000 years, the cola nut was not a snack. It was one of the most important commodities in the interior of Africa. Muslim traders from the Sahel loved it because their faith forbade alcohol, and cola gave them clean, sustained energy for long journeys across sand dunes and grasslands. Hausa caravans carried cola nuts north from the forest belt into the desert and returned south with salt, cloth, and glass beads. Whole cities like Kano and what is now northern Nigeria grew rich on this exchange. Ibn Battuta, the great Moroccan traveler, wrote about cola nuts in the 14th century, describing them as bitter and fragrant and prized among the powerful. Portuguese sailors in the 15th century, arriving on the coast of West Africa, saw cola changing hands like currency and shipped samples back to Lisbon. They called it, in their reports, the coffee of the Africans. An unfair comparison if you think about it, because cola had been famous long before coffee ever left Ethiopia. Now hold that image in your head. A trade route older than most European nations, running from the forests of the Guinea coast to the markets of Cairo, carrying a single caffeinated seed, because from that image, everything else in this story flows. Now imagine you are a 19th century pharmacist in Atlanta, Georgia. You have just fought in the Civil War, you have been wounded, and you have developed a serious morphine addiction while treating your own pain. You are looking for something, anything, that will get you off morphine and maybe make you rich in the process. Your name is John Stith Pemberton, and you have been reading closely about a French drink called Vin Mariani. Vin Mariani was Bordeaux wine infused with coca leaves. It was famous. Popes drank it. Presidents drank it. Sarah Bernhardt endorsed it. Pemberton wanted to make an American version, and he did. He called it French wine coca. But then Atlanta and the surrounding county passed prohibition, and alcoholic tonics suddenly became a legal problem. Pemberton had to reinvent his formula. He needed to keep the coca, and he needed to find a second ingredient that would deliver a similar stimulant kick. Something legal, something exotic, something that would give the drink both a jolt and a name people would remember. He chose cola. Here's where the story starts to bend in a way most people never learn, because Pemberton was not stumbling on something obscure. By the time he mixed cola into his new syrup, West African cola nuts were already showing up in European pharmacies, French tonic wines, and British medical journals. There was a small, quiet mania building around this seed, and Pemberton was catching the wave. But he was also catching something much older, something that had been rolling toward Atlanta for hundreds of years without him knowing. Consider what was happening on the ground in West Africa. Right at the same moment, Pemberton was tinkering in his lab. In the forests of what is now southwestern Nigeria and southern Ghana, cola production was booming. Villages organized entire economies around cola trees. Old trees were owned, inherited, disputed in court. A single mature tree could produce enough nuts each year to feed a family through the lean season, or to pay taxes to a chief, or to fund a long journey to the coast. Cola was so central to Yoruba culture that the word obi, the ceremonial cola nut, appears in prayers, proverbs, and rites of passage still practiced today. When a stranger enters a Yoruba home, the offering of cola is not a snack. It is a promise. It says, "You are safe here. Break this with me, and we are bound by the rules of hospitality." Igbo elders still open community meetings by praying over cola. In many West African weddings, the marriage is not sealed with a ring, but with the sharing of a single split nut. Farther north, across the Niger River, the Hausa built one of the great caravan networks of the pre-modern world. Cola nuts were their premium cargo. Fragile, perishable, aromatic. They had to be wrapped in damp leaves, packed carefully, kept cool, and moved fast. The men who did this, the fatak, the long-distance traders, were legends. They walked or rode camels for months across some of the harshest terrain on the planet, carrying nuts that could be worth their weight in silver by the time they reached Timbuktu or Tripoli or the Ottoman markets on the Mediterranean coast. This is the piece almost nobody in the West grew up hearing. When Europeans finally arrived in West Africa in force during the 19th century, they did not discover cola. They did not introduce it to global markets. They found cola already circulating in a trade system that had been running for at least 700 years, connecting the coast of Guinea to the salt mines of the Sahara, to the courts of North Africa, to the ports of the Red Sea. Zoom out. Picture a map. Draw a line from what is now Lagos to Cairo through the interior. That line was cola. Draw another from Kumasi to Marrakesh. That was cola too. The African interior was not, as later colonial writers would claim, a blank space waiting to be discovered. It was crisscrossed by commercial roads paved with dried leaves and camel dust, and on those roads moved a nut that made kings rich, kept scholars awake, and turned traders into wealthy men. By the 1880s, European powers were carving up Africa, and Pemberton, an ocean away, was carving up a formula. Word had spread in European medical journals about a wonder seed from West Africa that could banish fatigue and sharpen the mind. Pharmaceutical companies in London and Paris were importing cola. Extracts appeared in tonics, in wines, in patent medicines with names like Frederick Stearns and Company's Cola Cordial. Pemberton was part of that larger moment. He was not inventing something new. He was translating a West African tradition into a Southern American product. And here is the quiet, sharp thing about that translation. He was doing it in a country that, 21 years after emancipation, was in absolutely no mood to credit Africa with anything at all. On May 8, 1886, at Jacob's Pharmacy in Atlanta, Pemberton served the first glass of a drink that combined coca leaf extract, cola nut extract, sugar, caramel, and a proprietary blend of oils and spices mixed with carbonated water. His bookkeeper, Frank Robinson, suggested the name. 2 words, alliterative, easy to remember, drawn straight from the 2 ingredients that gave the drink its punch: Coca-Cola. The first advertisement, published in the Atlanta Journal that same month, called it delicious, refreshing, exhilarating, invigorating. Nowhere did the ad mention that cola was the anglicized name of a sacred West African seed traded across the Sahara since the Middle Ages. Nowhere did it mention Kano, or the Hausa, or the Yoruba. The origin was already being polished away in real time in the very first sentence the brand ever spoke about itself. Pemberton would not live to see what happened next. Sick and still struggling with morphine, he sold off pieces of his formula in his final years. By 1888, he was dead. The rights were consolidated by another Atlanta pharmacist named Asa Griggs Candler, who understood exactly what he had bought. Candler was a marketer. He was one of the first great marketers of the industrial age. And the story he told about Coca-Cola, the story he printed on every bottle, every trolley car ad, every wall calendar, was a story about the American South, about refreshment, about wholesomeness. It was not, and would never be, a story about a nut from West Africa. Now the numbers start to get remarkable, and this is where the buried history starts to sting a little. In the early 20th century, as Coca-Cola exploded across the United States, demand for cola nut extract also exploded. American importers began sourcing cola from British and French colonies in West Africa. West African farmers who had already been trading cola for a millennium suddenly found themselves supplying a new industrial buyer with a bottomless appetite. But here is the twist that most people never encounter. Coca-Cola's dependence on West African cola was for a stretch of decades real and substantial. And then, slowly, quietly, it wasn't. By the middle of the 20th century, food science had advanced enough that Coca-Cola could rely primarily on synthetic caffeine and carefully engineered flavorings to reproduce the effect of cola nut extract. The exact modern formula is one of the most famously guarded secrets in commercial history, and the company has been careful never to lay it out in full. But independent analyses over the years have consistently suggested that the amount of real cola nut extract in a modern can of Coca-Cola is minimal at best, and possibly zero. The nut that gave the drink its name is, in the drink itself, largely a ghost. Meanwhile, the brand built on that ghost became one of the most valuable in the world. Coca-Cola today, by most independent brand valuations, is worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $90 to $100 billion as a name alone, before you count factories, distribution networks, or the vast web of bottling contracts that wraps the planet. The word cola in that name is a direct loan from West African languages. It is arguably one of the most economically successful pieces of linguistic borrowing in history. Now flip the coin. Consider what happened to the cola trade itself. In West Africa today, cola farming continues. Nigeria remains one of the largest producers in the world. Cola is still central to ceremonies. Guests are still welcomed with obi. Marriages are still sealed with it. Elders still chew it before long conversations. In markets from Lagos to Accra to Douala, you will still find piles of cola nuts, sorted by variety, freshness, and color, tended by women who have been doing this since they were children, sold by weight, wrapped in leaves. But the global picture is completely different. The industrial buyer that once fueled a modest export boom now sources its stimulant from a factory. The name on the billion-dollar can no longer refers, in any meaningful ingredient sense, to the seed it was named after. The story on the label, mid-century diners, polar bears, holiday commercials, snowy mountains, has nothing to do with a house a trader walking north with a pack camel, or a Yoruba grandmother splitting a nut in half to welcome a visitor to her compound. That is the twist you have been waiting for. The nut gave the brand its identity, its name, its original chemical kick. The brand, in return, gave the nut nothing. Not credit, not partnership. Not, in the end, even a place in the recipe. Sit with that for a second. And then sit with this. The erasure of cola from the Coca-Cola story is not really a story of malice. It is a story of how modern branding works. Brands are simplification machines. They compress complicated origins into clean logos. They replace long, tangled histories with a script font and a color palette. Nobody at Coca-Cola sat down one day and decided to hide West Africa. It is more that the brand told a different, tidier, more marketable story. So many times, in so many places, over so many decades, that the original story simply disappeared into the background hum of the 20th century. And now think about the last time you cracked open a can of Coke. Maybe today, maybe yesterday. That fizz, that bite, that quick clarity when the caffeine hits, you are drinking in name, if not in substance, a beverage descended from a seed that was chewed by scholars in medieval Timbuktu. You are holding in your hand a linguistic fossil of one of the great trade routes of the pre-modern world. That is the revelation this story has been building toward. The most globalized product on Earth carries in its name a whisper of a much older globalization. Long before Wall Street, long before container ships, long before anyone had ever spoken the phrase supply chain, West Africans were running an intercontinental trade in a caffeinated seed that would one day, by way of a Georgia pharmacist and a bookkeeper hunting for a catchy name, become the most recognizable brand on the planet. The cola nut did not conquer the world by being marketed. It conquered the world by being real, by containing in its tissue the exact chemistry that tired human beings across cultures have always sought out. Coffee did the same thing. So did tea. So did chocolate. But of the four great caffeinated commodities of history, cola is the one whose origin has been most thoroughly forgotten by the average consumer, even though its name is printed more times per day, per hour, per minute than any of the others. So what do you actually do with this? You do not have to swear off Coca-Cola. You do not have to give a lecture at your next barbecue. The story of cola is not a story that demands guilt. It is a story that offers a lens. Here is the lens. The next time you see a globally famous brand, ask a simple question. Where did the name come from? Not the marketing, not the logo. The name itself. Very often, the word on the label points back to a place, a plant, a people, a piece of a much older world. Chocolate points to a Mesoamerican word. Coffee points to a region of Ethiopia. Tea points to a Chinese trade route. Cola points to the Gulf of Guinea, and to markets in Kano, and to camel caravans crossing the Sahara. That is your next action, and it is a simple one. Read the label, ask the question, do the 2-minute search. You will be amazed how often the answer takes you somewhere unexpected, because once you start doing this, you cannot really stop. The supermarket becomes an atlas. The drinks aisle becomes a trade route. Every jar, every bottle, every bag contains a small buried story, and most of those stories lead somewhere older, richer, and stranger than the packaging suggests. And that changes what it means to be a modern consumer. Not in a heavy way, not in a guilty way, in a curious way. You start to move through the world with your eyes open, not to condemn what you see, but to see it more clearly, to notice how much of what looks new was always old, to notice which names carry credit and which names carry silence, and to notice which forgotten places, once you look at them properly, are actually right there on the front of the can in your hand. The cola nut is one name that carried silence for a very long time. Now you know how to hear it. Think back to where this started: a pharmacist in Atlanta, a bookkeeper, a bottle, a name. Now widen the frame. Push the camera back until Atlanta is a dot on a map, and the ocean is a strip of blue, and West Africa is a green wedge on the far side. Watch the arrow of history run the other way. Not from Atlanta out to the world, but from the world into Atlanta. From the forests of the Gulf of Guinea, through the caravans of the Sahel, across the Atlantic and colonial ships, into a small pharmacy on the corner of a southern street, into a green bottle, into a red can, into your hand. That is the shape of the real story. It has always been the shape of the real story. It just took a little digging to find it. Most people will never dig. Most people will pop open a Coke tonight and never wonder why it is called that. That is fine. Brands are designed to be forgotten as origins and remembered only as feelings. But you are now part of the small minority who knows. You know the name is a fossil You know the fossil is West African. You know the tree still grows, that the ceremonies still happen, that the trade still moves quietly in markets that most travel guides do not print. And the next time somebody in your life pops the top on a can, you will hear the fizz a little differently. You will hear 1,000 years of trade routes hissing out at once. You will hear the whisper of a nut that most of the world has never tasted, but whose name almost everyone on the planet, in one language or another, has learned to say. That is the story of cola. That is the story hidden inside the most famous drink on earth. And somewhere in a forest in West Africa, right now, another tree is growing.